conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Welcome to the California State University of San Bernardino Conversations on Race and Policing, a series that began in 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd. Series organizers are Matt Patino, Crafton Hills College instructor of history, formerly Rialto Police Department, Dr. Mary Teixeira, the CSUSB Professor Emerita of Sociology, formerly of the LA Sheriff's Department, Amber Broaden, Adjunct Professor of Psychology at CSUSB and CSU Dominguez Hills, Stan Futch of the West Side Action Group, retired from the Riverside Police Department, Roby Madrigal, Public Affairs and Communications Specialist, and Jeremy Murray of the CSUSB History Department, and Thin Lee, who makes it all possible. I'm Mike German, a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and former FBI Special Agent. And now I'll turn it over to Stan for the land acknowledgement.
CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that the California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral lands of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhabatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I'll pass on to Jeremy.
Thanks, Stan and Mike. It's a delight to welcome today Professor Alison Phipps. Professor Phipps has been a scholar, activist in the movement against sexual violence for the past 20 years. She co-authored the groundbreaking National Union of Students report, That's What She Said title, and has written for many publications, including The Guardian, Open Democracy, and Times Higher Education. She's currently professor of sociology at Newcastle University. Professor Phipps is a political sociologist, scholar of gender with interests in feminist theory and politics, the body and violence, and neoliberal racial capitalism. She has pursued these in various areas, including sexual violence, sex work, reproduction, and institutional cultures. She's been the chair of the Feminist and Women's Studies Association in UK and Ireland, and was a co-founder of the Safe Studies Network, now called Universities Against Gender-Based Violence. I'm going to list some books and organizations, and I'll be sharing the links for those in the chat in just a little bit. She's currently co-leading the Feminist Gender Equality Network's Gender-Based Violence Group, and she is one of the patrons of the Association of Gender Studies in Africa. She recently launched a new collective called Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence with her Newcastle colleagues, Nikki, Godden-Rasul, and Tina Sikka. Phipps is the author of many articles and books, and a full list is at her faculty profile, which I'll share. They include Me, Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism from Manchester University Press, and The Politics of the Body, Gender in a Neoliberal and Neoconservative Age from Cambridge Polity Press, and the winner of the FWSA Book Prize. We'll share links to that, as well as some of her most recent open source articles. I also want to thank my partner, Catherine, for recommending this excellent guest of Professor Phipps today. It's an absolute delight to host you as part of the series, Professor Phipps. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Before I start, I just want to say you have my full solidarity over there across the Atlantic with everything that's happening, attacks on university, attacks on DEI. We are all watching and we're all with you and supporting you over here. And as I said before we started, we're a few steps behind. It's not quite as bad here, but we always follow in your footsteps. So we are We are right behind you. I do have a visual aid. Shall I share that now? I think it might be helpful as I'm talking.
Go ahead and
I think I
share your
can.
screen.
Yeah, I think I can share that. So share. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you still see that now? Yeah.
Yes.
You can still see the visual aid. Perfect. So this talk, and I'm so pleased to be invited to do this, because I do have a book coming out which is very much focused on the topics that you all focus on in your group and in this series. The book is called Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, and it focuses on what sexual violence does in racial capitalism. By that, I mean, what is the role of sexual violence as racial capitalist systems corral, mold, use, and discard the workers that they require? So violence, as you all know, is a basic means of moving from difference to division to domination. And this violence is very often sexualized. And the book has come partly out of my own failures of activism, actually, of trying to tackle sexual violence in the university system, but also from within mainstream feminism, as my last book described, and seeing some of the major drawbacks of mainstream feminism, which a lot of which are to do with whiteness and the way that whiteness operates as a political framework. So this book is my attempt to sketch a conceptual framework, which I hope will be a little bit deeper and a bit more useful as we try to tackle sexual violence. I do draw on a lot of theoretical texts in the book, but I say in the introduction that it's not a book on or of theory, because I think theory does too much and too little. It's kind of grand narratives and angels dancing on pinheads at the same time. I don't really want to occupy that space, but I will borrow a phrase from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and say that I want to try to describe and try to explain the how and why of sexual violence in racial capitalism, hoping to support what she calls complexly thoughtful action. I'm old enough to know that action needs to be grounded and specific, but it also needs to be underpinned by concepts that are imaginative and expansive. So that's one of the things that I hope to do with the book. And we can talk more about my activism as well in the Q&A if you'd like to hear a bit more about that. I think secondly, before I start as well, it's important to note that the book took its final shape in context of the Gaza genocide. And as I completed the manuscript, stories about the Hamas rapes were persistently being used to justify the mass killing of Palestinians. So with that in mind, one of the key things I want to communicate in the book, and which is probably of the most interest to your group, I would think, is that the fabric of racial capitalist domination that at the extremes culminates in human sacrifice is stitched together by both acts and imputations of sexual violence. And I'll return to that in a minute. So as the book is called Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, I think it's probably worth me saying something at the outset about how I understand race. So first of all, drawing on Gargi Bhattacharya and Cedric Robinson, I see race as a mode of socio-economic organisation. The book focuses on different capitalist processes, so exploitation, expropriation, expulsion, and extermination. To oversimplify, we might see the exploitation as how class is made. We might see expropriation as how gender and race are made, whether that's through the expropriation of slave labour, socially reproductive labour, or natural resources. Expulsion, which means relegation to what Sanyal calls the post-colonial wasteland, is profoundly racialized. And once you've been expelled from productive relations, you are effectively left for dead. So the book looks at the role of sexual violence, acts of sexual violence, threats of sexual violence, imputations of sexual violence, and also the punishment of sexual violence or imagined sexual violence in all of these dynamics. So that's the first way I understand race. Secondly, drawing on Rita Lara Segato, Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Winter, Sadia Hartman, I'm sure you've all read all of these people. I see race as a mode of subjectivation. So the book asks, who is able to be a subject, who is rendered a body, and who is reduced to the status of flesh? And that relates to my third understanding of race, also drawing on Cheryl Harris, Ronaldo Walcott, and others, which is as a relation to property and a property relation. So although feminist theories of sexual violence have tended to see women as property in a homogenizing way, I'm asking how property is disaggregated by gender and race. So that begs the question of who counts as property to be protected, who is property to be violently used and then thrown away. So a key part of my argument is that the idea of sexual threat is itself raced, and that the protection of bourgeois whiteness, and in particular the bourgeois white woman, has been central to various projects that dispose of surplus populations. So sexual violence can be a political device in all kinds of ways. And racial for me is not an inert adjective. I use, if any of you have read Rethinking Racial Capitalism by Gargi Bhattacharya, I use Gargi's spatial metaphor for racial capitalism, which is a house with many stories. So an attic, a cellar, several annexes that have no direct connections, main rooms which are comfortable, and then a maze of unmappable corridors leading to all sorts of barely remembered wings, snugs, and the occasional route to a seemingly isolated outhouse. And this is a residence for all kinds of people. Some of them live in comfort and some don't. All of their movements are limited by what Gargi calls the strange geography of the building. So the concept of racial capitalism in Gargi's work sees economic formations as demarcating the walls between different groups of human beings and controlling who enters which rooms and how, all of which serves the production and accumulation of value. And I argue that a lot of this relies on sexual violence in different ways. So although patriarchy and sexual violence obviously predate racial capitalism, I argue that racial capitalism shaped sexual violence in profound ways. What I call the coloniality of sexual violence, building on Maria Lagoni's coloniality of gender and other frameworks, describes how colonialism racialized sexual violence as a political economic strategy. As a result, I argue that a monopoly on sexual violence is constitutive of colonial modern man, and that's man with a capital M, as Sylvia Wynter would use it. So first, colonization, as you know, was accomplished via sexually violent means. Colonial imaginaries were profoundly sexually violent, and rape was a key tool of territorial expansion and primitive accumulation. Secondly, coloniality both emasculated and elevated indigenous men. So it imposed patriarchal relations that produced increased sexual violence in colonized societies, which then created an opportunity for violent regulatory control. And that's what Spivak calls white men protecting brown women from brown men. And as colonization progressed, and especially into slavery, the sexualized savage emerged as a pretext for murderous repression, what I call white men protecting white women from brown and black men. So what Fanon calls the massive psycho-existential complex of coloniality was deeply sexually charged. And importantly, this was all co-constituted with the transition to capitalism and the emergence of modern misogyny in Europe. So rather than capitalism being an export of European society and culture, these things were constituted together. So European women were sexually brutalized during the early modern witch hunts, as you will know if you've read Silvia Federici's work. But following this, the bourgeois white woman was recuperated into the colonial modern system in two different ways. First, as a properly gendered body, while the colonized and enslaved were either improperly gendered bodies or ungendered flesh. And secondly, as property to be protected by ruthlessly violent means. So the coloniality of sexual violence helps us to understand more deeply how sexual harm only counts at a formational level when enacted against middle-class white women or their proxies, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, by racialized men. So as I said before, some bodies are property to be protected, others are property to be transacted for political capital via protection when it's convenient, and still others are property that's already derelict, so can be violently used and then thrown away. And as you all know, I don't need to tell you this, that the colonial myth of the black rapist, as Angela Davis called it, prevails in racialized mass incarceration. It also changes form in what might be called the neo-coloniality of sexual violence, as it wends its way through war on terror formations, late capitalist authoritarian populism, and militarized border regimes that travel under the sign of anti-trafficking. So in all of these, I describe various combinations of sex exceptionalism, which situates sex violence as somehow worse than other harms, and sexual exceptionalism, which is the idea that sexual violence enters the national body from the outside, and that also includes the outsider within. And both of these create states of exception that allow populations to be geographically contained or economically excluded, expelled, or even exterminated, apparently in the service of tackling sexual violence. So this is what leads me to call sexual violence a bordering project. I also call this the racial capitalist protection racket. So women's safety, with white women representing the universal, is used as a pretext for carceral race war, while white men reserve the right to abuse and possess women themselves. The racial capitalist protection racket, as I call it, is deeply implicated, and you'll all know this already, in what Gilmore calls the rise of the cage as a large-scale, all-purpose solution to capitalist problems. So the prison is an internal form of warehousing with porous and productive relationships to external bordering. First, and as Gilmore writes, the border and the prison are counterinsurgencies created by racial capitalism's paradox of mobility and immobility. So in other words, when the constant motion of capital produces threats of social and political disorder, racialization and criminalization temporarily settle things. Secondly, the prison and the border are techniques of deproletarianization or exclusion from capitalist productivity and its civilizational connotations. So I write about how bordering and criminal punishment spatially organize the neoliberal order and how this is supported by the coloniality of sexual violence. So at the nation state level, the racialized category of sex crimes, supported by carceral feminism, both encloses white bourgeois women and authorizes the prison as an enclosure for racialized and proletarian men. Geopolitically, the racket takes various forms, continuing to change form through different imagined states of exception. And these add to the list of legitimate victims. So there are others allowed conditional subjectivity here, like migrant care workers in Europe, trafficked women and children, and working class white girls thought to be groomed by gangs of Muslim men in England in particular. So white women and these proxies for white women figure as property. They're to be abused at will, but violently defended from the others. In other words, they're protected as a pretext for violence and when racial capitalist interests are at stake. We all know that the men who protect women and the men who abuse them are often one and the same. This is encapsulated first by the high levels of sexual misconduct amongst police officers, secondly by rape and sexual abuse by officials in immigrant detention and at the border, and thirdly by the role of sexual harassment and rape threats in consolidating the brotherhoods that make up the contemporary far right. So this protection racket scaffolds the architecture of racial capitalist accumulation. Acts and threats of sexual violence render subjects docile through fear. That sustains accumulation via dispossession and also extracts free social reproduction, especially in the case of domestic violence. The ideologies around sexual violence also drive the white and bourgeois classes into the arms of carceral colonial states. This manufactures consent and also enables brutal violence against the other in the service of value extraction and growth. And this pincer movement, as I've described it, peaks in what Bhattacharya calls the edge spaces of racial capitalism, in which populations are both subjected to brutal sexual violence and constructed as sexual threats. So sexual violence, I argue, is one of the means by which fear realizes its use value. It's one of the means by which life, death, and living death is organized to support value generation. So these are perennial questions, which I have on my slide there. Which lives are to be protected at all costs? Which are to be protected in order to protect the system? And which lives are already meant to be lost? And all these can be and are articulated through acts and imputations of sexual violence. And I think I'll stop there to give us time for discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Phipps. There are a lot, I think there's a lot to discuss. And I want to welcome our attendees. We have a nice group in the attendee room there in this webinar. Welcome everybody to please type your questions into the chat, and we'll have time to answer them. I think I saw a few hands go up there, so I don't know if those were people logging on. But because the webinar format, what we have is the ability to type your questions into the chat. So please do that. And I know that there's a lot to talk about here. I know our other hosts, Stan and Mike, will, I'm sure, have questions and comments. So I want to open the floor before I do that to anybody who has any questions to start things off. Stan, were you going to jump in with a question?
Yes, I am. You mentioned the white women involvement, and one of the things I was looking at is which lives are to be protected to protect the system. And I know when I was in England, the banker was married, but he had a mistress. Everybody knew. And I don't know if it still exists, but the system was okay by his wife because it protected her from him. But the system was acceptable. And so can you talk about that a little bit?
You mean the use of one woman as almost a safety valve for another? Is that
no?
what
As you were saying that sexual violence is usually protected and done by the same person.
Yes.
So
yeah.
That's what this was to me. That's what that was kind of. In other words, he had this young mistress. He was doing whatever he wanted to, while at the same time protecting his wife from.
Yes. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I mean, I think the racial capitalist protection racket can be summed up by Donald Trump, right? Who has been credibly accused of sexual assault by, I don't know how many, I think 22, it might be more now, but who is still saying you should be scared of that Mexican over there who's going to cross the border and rape you. So it's a form of misdirection, which works, I think, at all levels. There's these individual white men with a lot of power who are doing this, but also the system. I mean, in the book I describe the interaction between domestic violence and street harassment, for example. So the idea that the streets are unsafe as being something which pushes women back into the domestic sphere where they are more likely to be abused. But all of that is racialized. So fear of street harassment is also at the root of a lot of street cleaning, which affects sex workers, homeless people who are kind of much more likely to be marginalized and from more marginalized ethnic groups as well. So I think the man who's protecting his wife but also has the mistress is also joined by the man who's protecting his wife but is also assaulting someone else, I guess. And that's sort of what the system does as well. It protects us. It says it's protecting us while assaulting us at the same time. So I think in the book I'm trying to thread that needle between discussing the complicity of white women, especially in this system, especially in the racialization of sexual threat, which you'll all know better than me, you know, goes way back, especially in the US, but also to say this isn't good for anyone. And actually, this is a form of enclosure, you know, of all women, in order to, among other things, extract that socially reproductive labor, which capitalism depends on. So that's part of the racket as well.
When I was in England, we were a novel, Black family living in town. And over the years, what happened with the migration of Africans into England, it became, like you said, a colonial type of protection type of thing. In other words, we can't have all this going on, and we have to protect our women. And then the thing was, they are the bad people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think it sort of changes form. So at the moment in England, at the moment it's trans people, but it's also Muslim men in England tend to be the focus of this, but it has been Black men, and also the protection racket focused on sexual violence is linked to protection rackets focused on other things, for instance, drug dealing and knife crime, which are very much racialized as Black. So I think it sort of changes form and lands on whichever group is the most is rendered the most surplus at any one point in time. And at the moment, we have a dynamic where female racialized migrants are sort of conditionally accepted because they do a lot of the caring work that white women don't want to do, work in our NHS, working in domestic service, et cetera, childcare. But male migrants are being vilified. So programs of, I don't know whether you've read Sarah Farris's work on femo-nationalism, but she talks about programs of civic integration across many European countries that were kind of set up as a way to integrate female migrants, and partly through protecting them from their violent men. So you have certain groups that are sort of conditionally okay and certain groups that are marked as disposable. And I think that what the book tries to do is to trace how that is very much linked to economic requirements and economic, the kind of the economic base of these structures.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you very much, Professor Phipps, for being here. You know, it was interesting for me to hear you talk about borders, and obviously the border issue has been significant in United States politics, and how politicians exploit sexual violence in a way to police the border, and obviously the highlighting of sexual violence by migrants, but also the downplaying of sexual violence by people, U.S. officials who are assigned to do that work at the border, and that tends to be ignored, if not, you know, downplayed, even by the media, which the government doesn't necessarily control. Can you talk about that interplay of politicization of this sexual violence at the border, but obviously at other places too?
You mean how it's kind of downplayed and upplayed in different ways?
Right. Yeah, you know, that often in the United States, they'll talk about how the media likes to sensationalize stories. So you can understand why they would take an instance where a migrant perpetrated some horrible act and sensationalize it, but how they all but ignore sexual violence by government officials.
They do. I mean, I don't know. I mean, our media in this country is shocking, shockingly bad. I don't know whether your media is quite as bad as ours. But it really is, you know, they will, and they love stories about sexual violence. But as you say, stories about sexual violence that can be sensationalized and that will be picked up by, you know, the authoritarian populists and kind of disseminated that way. So it is very difficult to get stories into the media about sexual abuse, which is being perpetrated in immigrant detention, in prisons as well. I mean, we did have a very high profile case of Sarah Everard, who was raped and murdered by a serving police officer who used his police credentials to get her into his car. She was walking home one night, and that did make the papers. But there is a lot. But Sarah Everard was a white middle-class woman. So there are lots of stories that don't make it into the papers because the victims of those stories are not as palatable. They're not the ideal victim that the media wants to highlight. So I think that's a big part of it. It's who counts as a victim. And sexual violence is legible when it is perpetrated against white women by racialized men. So the white women part of that is important as well as the racialized men. So in the book, I didn't have time to talk about that in this talk, but I do spend some time on who is intelligible as a victim of sexual violence, and that is racialized in many, many different ways. I mean, obviously, you know, the history of slavery in that and the racialization of the Black female body as being almost unrapeable is a big part of that. And there are also other types of racialized bodies which kind of figure slightly differently in this calculus, but it's the same kind of calculus, you know, who is able to be raped. So for who is property that can be ruined by rape because it is worth something, and who is property that is already ruined. So there is no chance that would be ruined. So I think that's where I try to complexify that feminist discourse of women are property, because it needs to be nuanced. It needs to be a much more intersectional argument than that.
On the same tip, Mike was touching on American history, colonial. The whole thing was people came to the country and they took over. They claimed it as their own. It wasn't their own. It was the Indians, indigenous. And then if you look at our media, our movies and such, what we do is we romanticize the pillaging and raping of the women. Oh, the captain fell in love with the Indian girl and they lived happily ever after, which never did happen. So on. Could you talk about that a little bit? The media and the portrayal of how they put people in their places.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And as you've said, colonialism was horrifically sexually violent. And I think Sarah Deer's book, The Beginning and End of Rape, is an excellent account, an excellent and harrowing account of that and the role of sexual violence in colonialism. But then, as you said, it gets caught up in these sort of frontiersman type narratives of white masculinity, where the sexually violated indigenous woman becomes something else and becomes a romanticized figure. And that is, I think, partly because of a sort of a more general, what would I call it? I mean, that's partly the way that the media functions now, in terms of elevating white masculinities and sort of erasing the realities of other groups. But I think that also tracks back to the coloniality of sexual violence, because one of the things I argue is that colonialism both perpetrates sexual violence and then displaces its own sexual violence onto the other. So Fanon talks about this as well, how, you know, the Black man especially, but also the indigenous man become invested with this terrifying sexuality. And that's what he calls the massive psycho-existential complex of coloniality, because this horrifically violent system has to find a way to rationalize itself and to justify itself. So the savage becomes sexualized, partly as a strategy, to sort of define people as not being fully human, but partly as a kind of psychic defense against the horrific violence of colonialism. It becomes kind of embodied in the racialized man. And that's why borders are so important, because borders represent our protection of the imperial core against the others who are going to come back and get us, the others who we've brutalized, and our brutality then threatens to come back and get us, which is why we need the border, because it's almost like we're scared of ourselves. We're scared of what we've done, and we're scared that what we've done will come back onto us, as it absolutely should. But that's why we have the border, I think. So I talk about bordering. I really like Gloria Anzaldua's interpretation of the border as well. You know, she talks about the US-Mexico border in particular, but she talks about Mexico as the doppelganger of the US, but the evil double, you know, that we're scared of, that we're scared will come back and get us. And I think that's a really good framework for the psyche of coloniality, basically, and how that's deeply racialized and deeply gendered and sexualized as well.
Well, you could go on forever, because the history of sexual brutality, I mean, it's forever. I mean, it's always been, as far as I know. And so, I mean, you could pick any topic, and there's tons of information and history about it. But I'm going to read one of the questions that somebody put in here. It says, you mentioned sexual violence and the fear of sexual violence in the political as a political device. I'm wondering, it just moved on me. Let's see where to go. I'm wondering how you think it will intensify it keeps bouncing.
Yeah, the new messages keep bouncing.
New message, just a minute. I keep wondering, let's see, where am I? There it is. Intensify. I just keep wondering how you think this will intensify in the US, especially with the persons we have in office, and maybe how it will affect the future of our historically female-dominated jobs in spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you will all know better than me, obviously, about what will happen in the US, but I mean, we've seen it happening already, haven't we? And again, we've seen it shift, you know, first it's the Mexican, then it's the Muslim, then it's the trans woman, you know, but it's always this sexually dangerous other and this sexually dangerous figure that we need to close some kind of border against. And I imagine that will only get worse. I don't know if you know this, but Elon Musk has recently been kind of attempting to meddle in the UK political system by talking about Muslim grooming gangs, and criticizing our Prime Minister Keir Starmer for not doing enough about Muslim grooming gangs back in the 2010s when all of this started to come into the news. So they do it because it works, because they know that as you said, the newspapers will pick it up, and people will. And I guess when times are really tough economically for people as they are, it's a lot easier to focus on that border, focus on that dangerous other, than, you know, focus on the whole system that is making all our lives less livable. So it's a very, very good strategy.
Here's another question. It says, in the UK or England, have you been seeing a shift reflecting this particular in men or more gender-based violence, not just towards trans people? With this rise of red pill and the figures like Andrew Tate, I have been seeing people be more comfortable spouting themselves these views. You have a friend in Birmingham, England, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, actually, the last chapter of my book is on the online space. So I talk quite a lot about Andrew Tate, and about incels, but also about the men who are offering up these platforms, you know. So it's the same men oftentimes, you know. Elon Musk is offering up these platforms on which these men are acting out, and also modeling this masculinity, which white men especially are expected to imitate, but can never imitate, they can never get there. So they're angry, and also their lives are getting worse, which is making them more angry. So yes, we have seen, it's hard to know whether the rates are going up or whether the reports are going up. So I wouldn't want to kind of say anything wrong in that area, but we're certainly seeing a lot more reported violence, especially in schools. So boys' attitudes towards female teachers seem to be changing. I've noticed a shift in my male undergraduate attitudes towards me. Actually, just in the past couple of years, it's very clear that as a female professor, they want to bring me down, which is new. So I do think that this is an issue, but of course, then it gets sensationalized, and the response to it is punitive again, which, as we know, is not the way. So I have a 11-year-old son at school. He's not into Andrew Tate, but some of the boys in his school year are. And in response to mention of Andrew Tate, they just get yelled at. So, you know, there's nobody to sit down with them and say, well, why do you like him? What do you like about him? What, you know, do you know about this? Do you know about that? There's no dialogue there. There's just punishment. And of course, if they think it's naughty, they're going to want to do it more, aren't they? So I've noticed both things, really. It's a kind of perfect storm of increased misogyny with increased carcerality amongst young people.
Can you speak a little bit on trafficking?
Yes. I mean, in the book, I know trafficking has a different definition in the US to other places. I think in the US there is a much closer relationship between sex work and trafficking, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve being transported across a border. In the UK and in other European countries, it has to involve being transported across a national border to count as trafficking. So trafficking in my book is related to bordering, and I talk quite a lot about how campaigns against trafficking are also racialized, how kind of the emergence of trafficking as a problem, as a kind of global problem at the start of this century, really, was very sexualized. So, you know, we had concerns about trafficking before, but sex trafficking emerged as a global problem quite recently. And it was really that focus on sexual violation and sex trafficking that caught the imagination of the media, etc. And I talk mostly about how responses to trafficking are to close the borders, are to deport people, are to criminalize people. So saving women from trafficking in the UK seems to involve raiding the brothels and deporting the sex workers. Or saving women from trafficking might be criminalizing men who buy sex, but without offering women who sell sex any alternative routes into employment. So all you're doing then is pushing the sex industry further underground, making it more unsafe, and not actually dealing with the problem. Similarly, you're not dealing with the fact that it's our violent border regimes that lead people to take dangerous routes to cross borders, including through selling sex, that they wouldn't need to do if we had more open border regimes. So it's really kind of situated in that way. And I talk about how trafficking is also racialized. So certain countries, certain types of people are seen as more likely to traffic or be trafficked. I use Madavi's work on trafficking and terror as a portmanteau. You know, this idea that these dangerous Muslim fundamentalist men are selling women into sex and using the proceeds of that to finance terrorism. That's something which is really becoming quite a strong paradigm. And I think the Muslim grooming gangs paradigm, it sort of sits alongside that in a way. You know, these kind of all-purpose evil men that we're now seeing emerge. So that's kind of where I situate trafficking in my book, I think.
You know, on the last question, I'm sorry, I need to go back. I missed the last part of it. It says, I do have a friend in Birmingham, England, but even they seem to have noticed a sudden conservative shift in younger boys and men, a shift towards conservatism.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've seen some polling recently is it Generation Z now? Is that what we're on? I think Generation Z, the polling showed that young men were more likely to have right-wing views and young women were more likely to have more progressive views. But I would like to see that disaggregated by race, I have to say. So I'm kind of loath to say anything about boys and men as a whole. I think it might well be white boys and young white men. And there is a kind of aggrievement amongst that group. And there's no doubt that for working class people, some of whom are white, some of whom are not white, life is really awful in this country and in lots of other countries at the moment. But the way it gets taken up in this country is about white boys. So white boys are suffering because of race equality. White boys are suffering because of gender equality. White boys are suffering because the wokerati are dominating the world. So yeah, I would like to see those statistics taken apart, really, which young men are more conservative and which are not.
Okay, you'll be muddled in the waters.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
And I think a lot of that question is what is conservatism today? They distinguish between conservatism and Trumpism, or
yes,
you had earlier mentioned the neoliberal sort of embrace of Thatcher conservatism.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part of it, is that our lexicon hasn't really caught up to the changing map. But there's an interesting question in the chat that I wanted to bring up. It says, Professor Phipps, you mentioned that in the book's conceptual framework, that it was partly shaped by your experiences in activism, particularly within the university system and mainstream feminism. Could you elaborate on some of the key lessons and insights gained from those experiences, and what were most influential in developing the framework for the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I'm a bit of a failed activist, really, because I started my activism and my scholarship on sexual violence in universities in 2005. As soon as I started, I used to be the director of gender studies at Sussex University, and I think as director of that program, I was approached by a lot of students who had experienced things and wanted to advocate for them, and ended up working with our National Union of Students on the first national study of violence against students. That was in 2010. And then following that, I wrote a report on lad culture and sexual violence in universities, which was really about white men, white middle-class men at more elite institutions, but a bit of the frat sort of culture and what they were doing. And following that, there was a massive explosion of activism and movements, and I did various other projects, including a project called Changing University Cultures, where we tried to examine how the whole institution was sort of framing sexual violence. I call myself a failed activist because the movement against sexual violence in universities in this country has gotten extremely carceral. And I think that's partly because it's being led by a lot of white women who don't have a particularly intersectional approach. And I think it's partly because it suits the universities. So it's a lot easier for them to tackle it via student discipline, and also to do the prevention side of things in a very perfunctory way. So, we'll have an online course on consent in sexual relationships, and then we've done that bit. So that's also a kind of perfect storm of things. So we're now seeing institutions having to have more like Title IX type systems, like what you have in the US, which there's a big feminist literature critiquing Title IX in the US, which you're probably already aware of, written by US feminist academics, a lot of them feminists of colour. But the UK is now going down that road using student discipline. There's also been proposals for a sex offenders register of academics, which is something that, just makes me kind of shake in my shoes, so all of these things are happening, which I don't support, and I've become a bit of a thorn in the side of the movement at this point, I guess. I just poke them with a stick, every so often, and I try to keep writing about why we need to do it differently, why abolitionist approaches, while harder, are much more promising. And we do now have a kind of critical mass of abolitionist scholars and organisers in the UK. And I set up the Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence Network at Newcastle, and we have about 300 members now. But also we work quite closely with Abolitionist Futures in London. We've recently done a resource on tackling gender-based violence without prisons and police, which is similar to one that came out of the US. And I can't remember whether it was Insight or Critical Resistance that did it, but to do with non-reformist reforms in the police. So, how do we dismantle rather than preserve the institution? So I guess the book came out of all that because, and the book's been in the works for about 10 years, but the book came out because my own understanding of sexual violence deepened through the failures of my activism and through me kind of looking for conceptual frameworks that would help me in my own worldview. And this is kind of the result, which is much bigger than the university space, but hopefully it will be useful.
Jeremy?
Thank you. Thanks, Stan, and thanks, Alison. A quick, I want to kind of, and I know we only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to kind of bring it back to basics a little bit here, just for some of our audience members, and that includes me, who I think would benefit from a couple quick words about this very, very important term, carceral feminism, which for many is, for you, it is sort of a bread and butter of the kind of work that you're doing. But I think just in terms of the attendees of this program, it might be very helpful to have a working definition and a sort of fundamental understanding of this term carceral feminism to sort of take with us from this session. Can you speak about that idea?
I can.
Thanks.
Yeah. So carceral feminism was a term that was coined in 2010, I think, by Elizabeth Bernstein, in an article that it has carceral feminism in the title. If you Google her with carceral feminism, you should find it. And it's basically feminism that situates the criminal punishment system, the criminal legal system, as the answer to sexual violence. So in order to stop sexual violence, we need higher conviction rates, which means we need more police on the streets. We need more resources into policing. We also need longer sentences. So we need to increase the sentencing. And you might be familiar with the case of Brock Turner, the Stanford student who was convicted of rape, and the fact that lots of feminist groups campaigned for him to have a longer sentence. Oh, thank you. You found the article. Brilliant. So that's carceral feminism in a nutshell. I mean, I guess at a deeper level, carceral feminism would say we need to look to authority in order to solve these problems. So we need protection, and we need protection from the state or from authority. And one of the ways I've tried to extend the definition of carceral feminism in a way is through saying we're looking in universities, we're looking to the institution to protect us. And especially given that we know what the institution is, we know that these are capitalist colonial institutions. Why would we look to the institution to protect us from sexual violence? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's very much linked with white feminism. Not that feminists of color cannot be carceral feminists, they can be, but oftentimes a more intersectional feminist perspective will take you away from carceral feminism because you're thinking, well, surely this is kind of protecting one group at the expense of another group. So it's very much within that white feminist frame. Susan Brown-Miller's book on sexual violence against our will, which was written in 1975, is kind of a classic of carceral feminism. And Angela Davis actually wrote about Susan Brown-Miller in her book, Women, Race and Class. Angela Davis wrote a chapter on the myth of the Black rapist, where she engaged directly with Brown-Miller and her work. So if you're interested, the Elizabeth Bernstein article would be good to look at, but then maybe have a little look at Angela Davis's book and her chapter on Brown-Miller.
Thank you for that. And that gets right to the racket idea. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
So with that being said, there's a question that says, what do you think is the appropriate way to prevent sexual violence?
Yes, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think obviously dismantle capitalism, that would do it. But on a practical on a practical level, I think, as abolitionists working on sexual violence, there are a lot of experiments ongoing in terms of what could we do to change the conditions that produce sexual violence. I mean, something as simple as a food bank in your local community can actually have a preventative effect on sexual violence. I wrote an article recently on, we call it community power in the UK. It's a kind of local government framework which is to do with solving local problems with local people. And I recently wrote a paper with Gabriella Muedzi about how a lot of these actions, community participation, green spaces, food bank work, all of that can have a preventative effect on sexual violence. In terms of actual prevention work, I don't think, like prevention programming, I don't think lecturing at boys and men is the way to go. There's been a lot of lecturing in this country since the movement around sexual violence in universities started. There's been a lot of telling boys and men that sexual violence is wrong. They know it's wrong, some men do it because they know it's wrong, because that's part of the thrill of it. Some men do it because of other reasons. Some young men do it at universities because there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's they don't know where the boundaries are. They get themselves into a pickle. So I think we have to kind of take this in a very nuanced way and kind of recognize that there is a continuum of sexual violence, and all from sort of sexual harassment through to rape, they all have similar functions, but there's not always the same motivations. So if we genuinely want to prevent sexual violence, we need to kind of work with people. I mean, I guess that's the abolitionist kind of framework, isn't it? Nobody is disposable, and that even means people who are perpetrating sexual violence. It doesn't mean that people that they have sexually harmed have to forgive them and work with them, but somebody needs to. I think if everybody's lives were better, then there probably wouldn't be as much sexual violence. And I do think there is evidence. There is evidence that sexual violence was not as common in indigenous cultures before they were colonized. I'm not saying they were completely free of violence. I'm not saying they were completely gender equal. But Sarah Deer's book is really good on that there is evidence that it wasn't as widespread and it wasn't as systematic as it is under racial capitalism. So understanding that, I think, is quite valuable.
You mentioned alcohol, drugs. How do we okay, not okay? Where do we go when that comes? Because what's going on in the colleges is that, well, I was drunk and I didn't mean to, or she says I was drunk and I don't know what happened. Those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard one, isn't it? Because you don't want to ban things. I don't believe in banning things, and you don't want to moralize to students about alcohol and drugs. But I think you can't say that it's not a factor. Everybody's inhibitions are down when they've had drink. Everybody's inhibitions are down when they've taken drugs. So I think, again, that does need to be part of the conversation. How do you kind of work with people? And also, how do we protect each other? I think one of the things that I feel quite strongly is that in handing over protection to authority, whether that is the institution or the state, we deny ourselves the capacities to protect each other. And in universities, I've been in situations where an official complaint is made in situations where a difficult conversation would be more effective. And I'm not saying that the person who's been sexually harassed should have that conversation. I'm saying somebody else should. But I think if we were more able to do those kinds of things, we might be able to deal with it. Somebody's mates might say to him, "Oh, come on, Nate, you've had too much to drink, just leave her alone." we would look out for each other more. And I know people already do that, but I think that we, in kind of thinking, oh, somebody else will solve that problem, I think we also de-skill ourselves in handling these things in the moment, because it doesn't take special skills, actually. We all know how to intervene. We've just forgotten.
The time has come, but I just have one more question. As a failed activist, what would you change?
Oh my, what about myself or about?
Yes.
About
You said
myself. Yeah, what would I do differently? I don't know. I think, well, obviously I would know what I know now then. I think that if I'd read more widely, if I had sought out more diverse, more diverse groups of people to collaborate with from the beginning, then I might not have made some of the mistakes I made. I was very much embedded in the kind of white liberal feminism, as a lot of activists on sexual violence are. So I think I would probably unplug myself from that much earlier.
thank you. And our failures make us stronger. So
They do.
thank you so much for joining us today, Alison Phipps. And we look forward to your new book and hopefully get you back maybe next year or the year after that.
I'd love to. Thank you so much. This has been brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Fall Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Tin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.